Hello there, and thank you for joining me. My name is Richard Jones. I'm the founder of the Jones Brothers Coffee Company here in Amsterdam. This is the first in a series of coffee conversations with experts who I hope will provide us with some inspiring, some insightful, and sometimes maybe some challenging views on the coffee industry as we know it today. I've been in the coffee industry for nearly 20 years, and more specifically in the specialty coffee segment. And this is the second coffee business that I've started. Now, I'm hugely passionate about the drink, but also for what coffee can do for people and how it creates and binds communities at both ends of the chain. I've written about it and initiated many conversations about it, but the inextricable link between coffee producer and coffee drinker is a little bit too shrouded, of course, and there remain many issues of inequality that have existed for many hundreds of years. So I'm absolutely delighted and perhaps a little overawed by my first guest in this series of talks, Erika Koss. Erika is, amongst many things, a researcher, a PhD candidate, specialty coffee AST trainer, teacher, writer, and mum. And as a father of two young ones, I know that being a parent is a full-time occupation all on its own. Erika's special interest and focus is on the coffee world, and she is currently a research associate of the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi in Kenya, conducting research on a coffee project on colonialism and gender, focused on Kenya, but with comparisons to other East African countries. So Erika, thank you so much for joining me today. It's absolutely a great privilege for me, and I know you're a busy person. So today we're going to dive into the history of coffee, using as our base an essay that you've written for the September 2020 edition of Barista Magazine entitled Coffee and Colonialism 101. I'd like to start by saying I really enjoyed reading the essay, a lesson in coffee history I didn't even know that I needed. But as it's International Coffee Day today, it seemed to me like a good time, and I quote, to pause to consider a longer history of how and why we are where we are in 2020, and to understand where the current inequalities in the coffee industry originated. Now, most of us know in the coffee industry that coffee is now produced in more than 70 countries around the globe. But what a lot of us probably don't know is the history of how coffee actually arrived in these countries and its link to a colonial past. And again, quoting from your essay, coffee is not a native crop to most of these countries. It didn't appear magically. Coffee arrived in these countries through colonial administrators or missionaries. So Erika, in the first part of this conversation, can we start by talking about exactly how colonialism has set the ground for these inequalities that we know exist today? Still only 10% or less of the value of the coffee stays in the origin countries. So my first question really is, if we're looking back to the mid-19th century, tell us how it all started and what colonialism is in this context.
Thank you, Richard. It's really great to be here and to meet you. I can't wait till we can all join together again in person and have these conversations. But for now, it's great. Happy International Coffee Day to you. Yep. And I think we need to begin with this, dark and bitter history that, is something that within specialty coffee, people will use that phrase a lot, the dark and bitter history. But I, especially given my original work in literature and in post-colonial theory, as I entered coffee more and more, I really was looking for a deeper story about exactly your question. What is this link between the challenges of today in specialty coffee and how does that link to the past? And so colonialism, there's many places we could begin that story, but Western colonialism, European colonialism is certainly one place to begin that story. Because of what you said, coffee being produced now in more than 70 countries, almost all of those, there is a colonial past. And there's some exceptions, of course, but there's still influence in terms of how coffee came to be this global crop. More specifically, how that began, I would say, especially when it comes to the part of the world that I focus on most, as in East Africa, had to do with this event that I named in that article called the Scramble for Africa, also known as the Partition for Africa. And that happened in 1884 and 1885, when European leaders were literally dividing up and creating the borders of Africa without ever having been to Africa, let alone having any African presence at that meeting. And almost all of the nation states of Africa today are actually based on those decisions from 1884. And so we can look at different parts of the world and see similar things, where those relationships of quite literally, how did Rwanda come to be Rwanda? How did Kenya come to be Kenya? You know, you have to look at the colonial past to understand that story.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. You mentioned the English missionary David Livingstone and the 3 C's of colonialism. What does that reference?
Right. The 3 C's of colonialism are, you know, it's like a lot of things in history. It's not something that was named that at the time, but when we look back, it's kind of a way that historians and scholars and writers and teachers can think about this, right? And, you know, David Livingstone was so praised during the time in Europe in particular, for being this great colonial explorer, you know, and there's all kinds of statues and buildings and things like that named after him, you know, in Zanzibar and East Africa. And, you know, when you look deeper, there's actually not a lot to praise about the things, some of the things he did when it comes to social justice and human rights. And so this idea of the 3 C's has to do with, it's just a quick way to think about how did colonialism work? How did it manifest itself, right? And so the 3 C's are commerce, Christianity, and civilization. And it's this idea that Europe really believed that they were bringing civilization to native peoples. And you know, that is exactly part of the problem now when we think about the legacies, because the question is, what civilization were they bringing when these people already had their own culture and their own languages and their own civilization?
Yeah, and in the later part of your essay, you talk about actually not just the physical, but the psychological impact of colonialism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Richard, because that psychological impact of colonialism is something that I think a lot of people overlook. You know, colonialism officially as a structure, as an unjust, you know, political, economic, legal, I would say racist system. You know, that was a structure that was created, literally created by Europe. You know, it's not something that just naturally magically happened, you know, one day. It was a planned creation. And so when we think about some of the challenges even in coffee today, and those, I would say, I would name them as colonial legacies. One of the big ones we can look at, and what people have written about and talked about a lot, is this idea of the mental kind of colonialism that happened alongside those political and legal structures. And so working together in terms of, you know, think about English language as an example. You know, the English language today is not the world's most spoken language, you know, but a lot of people think of English as that way, you know, and so we think about, you know, how languages come to be, you know, education, and just even, you know, the idea that people have about themselves in relationship to, you know, these structures. And so that's, you know, some of what that psychological impact is meant to get us to think about. Yeah, I think it's really significant, and it's part of, you know, I would say that officially colonialism is over in terms of the legal political structures. You know, almost all these countries have their independence now. They fought for it, they sacrificed for it, but these legacies are still with us.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because you then go on to talk about how the colonialists, well, the colonial powers, they brought these luxury or cash crops, coffee being one of them, of course, to these countries, but they essentially replaced subsistence crops, the crops that were being grown by the people that were on the land already. So tell us more about how that links between the past and the present day situation.
That's a great question, because when we look back at the colonial impact and its connection to coffee, I think it's really important that one place we begin is with trying to get to as specific as a story as we can, right? Because we have more than 70 coffee producing countries. We have even more coffee exporting countries, right? And so I think, if we can get more specific about, okay, what is the story in this country, or for this group of people within that country, that's one way to begin, I think, trying to think more deeply about this. And so if I can give an example with Rwanda, coffee as a cash crop didn't come to Rwanda until after, or actually just before World War I. And what was happening in terms of Rwanda and colonialism is a very complicated story between German and Belgium colonial rulers. And, there's a specific history there, right? For Kenya, as a comparison, coffee came in the 1890s. It didn't come as a big cash economy crop until the white colonial British settlers started to come after 1900. And so then you see this big expansion of coffee as something that native peoples are actually being forced through sometimes brutal and sometimes very violent means to replace their land. Not, they were farming crops to eat, right? Yeah. And feed their families. And then the colonial powers come in, and a lot of times that's settlers who are coming in, and people are being forced to then have coffee there. And then that cash from that coffee, right? It's not going back to the people so that they can therefore feed their families. It's actually going to the colonial family, the settlers, the missionaries, and then ultimately ends up to the states.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because we almost admire the fact that coffee has managed to get around so many countries in the world, but the historical context of how they've got there is perhaps not really appreciated, I think, So,
exactly. And in some places also, it was coffee and other crops as well. We would call them the luxury crops, in other words, the crops that native peoples didn't have, or maybe they had them, but it wasn't rooted on a cash wage economy, right? So that's the other part of this cycle is, how, the cash crops are this big distinction for people in terms of how they can feed their families and live their lives.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was really interesting as well. You make reference to the fact that in some ways there was this sort of missionary zeal, or this, driven mostly by religion, perhaps, or a civilizing influence. But what was going on in these faraway lands was not really known to the let's say the British public at large, or any of the other colonial peoples, if you like, until the introduction of Max Havilah, who is a very well-known name here in the Netherlands. But that book, first published in 1860, served to really raise the European consciousness about this sort of rather uncivilized mission of colonialism. Tell us a little bit more how that came about, why that was so instrumental.
Well, it's such a great point that this book, this novel, right, ended up being one way that some of these violent and brutal practices became known to a wider public. And I think it's important for us to think about the power of a single book, right? The power of a story that is imagined. This was a novel. It was a fictional novel, right? However, the author was a Dutch administrator in what is now Indonesia, right? At the time, Java. And he himself, as someone who was in this system, right, of colonialism, and he was, he had his job and he was getting his livelihood from this system. He was fighting against some of the practices in Indonesia at the time, and finding that, like, it wasn't changing. People weren't listening to him about, even trying to think about some more humane ways to treat people. And over time, he just thought, no, I'm gonna quit my job. I'm gonna go back to the Netherlands, but I'm also gonna write this book so that I can try to expose what's really happening down here.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to remember too. I mean, you and I are talking today in 2020, and we're so used to, here we are on Zoom, right, in different countries, right? And, we're used to information traveling so fast in terms of social media. In 1860, none of that existed. The way people learned about a different part of the world was through a book or through a journalist who might write about it, And so the idea that, Dekker writes this book under a pseudonym, right, about a fictional character who is modeled after him, right? We almost feel like Max Havelaar is a real person now, but actually he was created.
Yeah. I mean, I know some people who still believe that, actually. It's quite common. Like I say, it's a quite common name, but and it's very much associated with the fair trade movement, or the start of the fair trade movement. But I suspect that even a lot of Dutch people don't know perhaps how important a role he played, this character, I should say, and the author in this whole colonial history, really. So I mean, it's super interesting. I mean, as I've said to you previously, it's interesting to learn about, and to be honest, I've all these years I've been in the coffee industry, I've never really made myself totally aware of these issues, and I'm sure that's the same for a lot of people. So I want to move on to a sort of second part of our conversation, really, which is acknowledging the painful heritage as we've done. What is it that we can focus on as coffee lovers and coffee roasters, consumers in the Western world? How do we go about contributing to building a better future for coffee producers across the world? Specifically, of course, you have an interest in East Africa. And let me remind everybody about your essay, which appears in the September issue of the Barista magazine. It's well worth a read. And we will be sharing the link after we post this interview. You talk about, and I quote, decolonizing the mind takes awareness and effort. Can you tell us what you mean about that a little bit more?
Sure, I'd be happy to. When we talk about decolonizing anything, right, what we tend to be talking about, especially as scholars or writers, is we're saying we need to try to unlink ourselves and our structures with this colonial past, right? And, as I say in the essay, I absolutely believe what William Faulkner said, which is the past is actually not really the past, right? Yeah. So, but these are distinct things in terms of, the legal, political, economic structures and how that looks, right? When we think about, decolonizing our minds, one place to begin with that is, some of exactly what you've said, Richard, is that you've, been in coffee for 20 years, but these are things that you are becoming more aware of, and you're articulating it, right, in a new way. And the reason why you're talking about it in a new way is because you're thinking about it in a new way, right? Yeah. And so I really, really believe, and this is partly where, always as a, I'm trained in literature, that's my deepest passion is in literature. And so, when we think about the power of the imagination, we will never be able to imagine what people went through under colonialism, but we can learn more about what it was like for the records that we have. And then we can think about, okay, if that's our past, how can we never again have that past, right? But if we don't even know what the past is, if we don't even know what happened and we can't face that honestly, and name those challenges, right, then I think it's very hard to move forward in the future in a way that will have truly meaningful change.
Yeah. And that's, I'm kind of interested in that next. It's, turning to the future and today's efforts. Tell us what you think the contribution of coffee is in overall development, I guess, in these East African countries. And I know you're going to be returning to Nairobi shortly. What role do you think specialty coffee can play in reducing the inequalities that we've been talking about?
Reducing the inequalities in any supply chain will take actors from all parts of the supply chain, right? Especially when we talk about coffee. One reason why we all love coffee so much and we're so passionate about it is because we have all these friends and this coffee family around the world, and we see these different perspectives and we see these different challenges, right? But people don't experience those challenges in the same way. People in one part of the world, in one part of the supply chain, may or may not have the possibility to share their stories, to earn money, to own their own land, things like that. And one big group in particular that has had challenges with this is women. When we think about women throughout the coffee supply chain, I think very well, that coffee tends to be kind of a man's world sometimes. Mm-hmm. And even in many of the interviews that I have been conducting over the past 2 years for my research, people at all parts of the chain, they'll say, well, coffee's for the men. Coffee is a man's crop, right? Coffee is even a man's drink in some countries, right? And so, that's one way for us to think about decolonizing our minds and our practices when, let's just think about the fact that women around the world have different challenges than men do. And It's not to say that men don't have challenges too, because they do, right? But the challenges are different. And we need to recognize that, of course, I'm biased to that as a mother, thinking about, the challenge that women are having to try to take care of their children.
Yeah, and I think this is a very, interesting time that we're living in relation to having these broader conversations. And I think it's kind of interesting how this introduction, our conversation all resulted or came about as a result of you meeting with Christelle, our marketing director in Rwanda, a little over a year ago, I think. And I remember it reminds me of a story really that Christelle told me, that she was listening to a Rwandese official as he was making a speech at an opening ceremony of a new all-women's coffee cooperative. He said that when we empower a woman, we empower the entire country. And it's a very powerful statement. And as a result of that visit from Christelle, we're also very proud to be launching our own specialty coffee from Rwanda shortly, from a female cooperative called Hingakawa in the Rushashi region. So I'm very interested to know your insight into what you feel is special about women and coffee in Rwanda today.
Women in coffee in Rwanda today is incredibly special and important. We go back again, to a tragic time in 1994 when there was a genocide that had been previously in Burundi and then took place over about 100 days in Rwanda. And a lot of times you hear, even on coffee websites and coffee stories, specialty coffee will begin with the genocide, because what happened after the genocide is so many men were slaughtered or imprisoned that the country was quite literally left with a vast majority of women who did not have, sometimes they didn't even have a primary school education, often not a secondary school education. And so one of the things that Rwanda did, and it's often praised, in terms of the ways in which things transformed for women in positive ways despite this tragedy, it was very much through coffee. and the ways that groups of women formed and cooperatives of women formed out of necessity, right? And so you see, we were talking before about decolonizing our minds and ways to think about decolonizing coffee. And I think Rwanda is a great example of that, because you have women who they are taking the power for themselves.
Yeah.
And they are joyful, creative, strong, articulate women who are coming together to create this beautiful coffee that we can enjoy, right? Yeah. So I think, of course, like anything, there's always stories of sorrow and tragedy and poverty. But, part of the stories that I always try to focus on, even though I do talk so much about colonialism, is to say there are so many examples around the world where you can find men and women who are using coffee as a means of hope and a means of recovery and even a means of joy. People are very proud of their coffee, and to put their name on the coffee bag like you've done is a perfect example of a way to begin decolonizing coffee.
Yeah, I think it was a wonderfully inspiring sort of visit for Christelle, actually. I think it really got her into a much greater, deeper understanding of the impact that coffee can have. And I love the fact that we took the inspiration for the name and the design of our coffee from the women of this coffee cooperative. I mean, if ever there was an opportunity to, for them to stamp their name on the coffee, that was it. So yeah, we're very proud of that, and it's a beautiful coffee. We're absolutely delighted to really have the opportunity to let more people know about it. So I have to say, Erika, in the many years I've been in the coffee industry, I've met lots of people, I've had plenty of experiences. I don't really think I've ever had a conversation like this. So I am very grateful to you. It seems like such a good time, doesn't it, to be having these discussions, part of a wider introspection and debate that's going on, I think, particularly in Western cultures right now. So I'd like to thank you for bringing us this historical context of coffee to our attention. And I really hope, I think you would, that this is just the start of, as you say, excavating more stories of the development of the coffee industry that we can learn from, right? I think any future has to be designed from the lessons that we learn from history. And I hope that, with all of our efforts, we can find a way to ultimately rebalance many aspects of this community that we love so much. So I just want to say thank you. It's been a fantastic and short conversation. I think we could talk for a lot longer, and I hope we get the chance to do that. But
me too.
I'd just like to say thanks very much, and I wish you a very good day, and I hope to stay in touch.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate this. And I also want to say that I'm drinking this coffee right now, and it's fantastic. I brewed it on my Chemex, and it's just really a wonderful coffee. So I commend you all.
We will pass it on to the ladies at the Hingakawa Cooperative for sure. So we will tell them, yes. Thank you very much, and very best of luck with the continuing projects and the PhD and all the writing. I've been catching up on all the articles that you've written, so I'll be following you and much more closely going forward. So I hope to meet you one day as well.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.